Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our fourth edition or fourth week of Crop Diagnostic School with our question and answer series. I am going to give you a reminder to use the chat or the question function. So within GoToWebinar, you'll be able to see there's a questions or a chat list. You can go in there to post any of the questions that you have for our panelists today. We have the same group of panelists we usually have. So who I'm seeing on my screen, we have Dennis Lang, who is our pulse specialist. We have John Hurd for soil fertility questions. Ann Kirk is on the line for cereals. David Kaminsky for diseases. John Gavlosky for entomology. And all of your bug questions. We have Dane Fraze on the line as well to talk about canola and oil seeds. And then Kim Brown is also on the line today as well to talk about weed questions. So one of the first questions that we're seeing, and again, don't forget that you can go ahead and pose your questions again in the chat box for us and we will answer them. But to get us started, as we are just kind of getting people typing, a question that has come in is around soybeans. So Dennis, I'm going to throw this one to you. Starting to see iron deficiency chlorosis show up in my soybeans. Is there anything that I can be doing to help my soybeans get through it?
Well, I guess the biggest thing you can do right now is, number one, identify that it is IDC. So when you walk into the field, look at those newest leaves, see if there's intraveinal chlorosis, those dark green leaves. That's a telltale sign of iron chlorosis. The second thing you can do is just verify using your Seed Manitoba book, the variety that you're growing and what the IDC score is in the book. So if it's a 1.7, typically plants would stay green all the way through any kind of IDC concerns. If it's in the mid-2 range and from a 1.8 to 2.2, those ones typically will yellow and give it a week or so and they grow out of it. If, however, if it's in that 2.3 or higher range, and you're starting to notice some real severe IDC symptoms to the point where you're starting to see some stunted plants, some necrotic tissue on the leaves, that's a telltale sign not to put that particular variety on that field again. I think that's the lesson we have to learn. The biggest thing we can do is not worry about the IDC once we see it in the field, because there's really nothing you can do about it once you see it in the field. More so is preparation for next year and future years, identifying which varieties you're growing. There are some IDC susceptible lines that yield quite well on fields with low carbonates and low salts. However, if your salts are high and your carbonates are high, then it can be a real issue. And over the years, I've seen growers, walk away from certain varieties because they say, oh, it doesn't yield well. But yet, as you start asking questions about what the crop looked like, you saw these plants were stunted, then they go back to the soil test and they find out carbonates and salts were high. Even though we haven't had a lot of moisture this year, there's lots of salts in the top layer. So that's kind of the salt-induced IDC that we're seeing this year. But overall, from the fields I've seen, we started doing our ratings here last week, and there were second ratings at our IDC site close to Winnipeg. This week again, symptoms are very minor this year, a lot less than what I was initially thinking, considering how many, when I drove around in early spring and the salts that I saw on the soil surface. So just some things to consider. Not really a whole lot you can do with it now other than use it as a learning experience for future years.
And that's a good point too. I mean, soil salinity, all of these things that we're seeing, maybe not so much the moisture stress this year, but some of the other stressors that might be affecting soybeans. I know I had a call the other day about, iron deficiency chlorosis too, and people wondering about like, how am I going to deal with this? And sometimes there's not a whole lot you can do in the moment, but it is always good to be taking note of where you're seeing those symptoms showing up in the field. A question came in, and this one will be for you, David. Is there any temperature limit for fungicides when I'm spraying? What's the best advice right now, considering the hot weather, in terms of fungicide spraying in spring wheat?
Boy, you've caught me off guard. I guess we're talking about high temperatures, and one thing would be rapid evaporation of the product on leaves, which might leave the actives suspended outside the plant, especially those that are translocated into the leaf. I don't believe that there are any things like you would get with, say, those, which ones are they, John? The insecticides that you shouldn't use above a certain temperature, like decis, I guess, is one. There are no real restrictions like that. Did I miss something out of your question, Marla?
No, I think it was basically just about temperature limits and whether there was, high temperature restrictions when it comes to fungicide, I guess, for efficacy.
Yep, I guess there's one more thing, and that is temperature affects inversion. And you want to get the product onto your plant material, especially down within the canopy to coat it all. And if you've got inversion conditions, it's going to probably move up and away from the crop, which is not desirable.
Sorry.
I'll just make a comment based on what Dave said there about wanting hopefully to get that product on there before it just dries on the surface. And this year, myself and many farmers apparently are dealing with biologicals in crop. And many of them specify that they need to go on in the morning while it's cool because they're relying upon stomato entry. And yeah, if we're trying to get it into the plant, I guess we need it on there while the stomata are still open before they shut up later in the day to conserve moisture. Again, just something that I'm noticing on all these labels where we're trying these things.
Since we're talking about spraying to some degree and inversions, things like that, which Kim can always comment on as well. I do have also a question here for Kim. If we're dealing with glyphosate, how late can we go in and get that on to, say, either soybeans or canola? And Dennis, you can probably comment on the soybeans as well, but when am I going to be looking at my last glyphosate spraying?
Yeah, depends on the canola. The newer varieties are true flex varieties, and the beauty of those is that you can actually spray the higher glyphosate rates, which realistically everybody was doing anyways, but it was probably costing some yield loss because the way the true flex canola is structured now, it's just a safer, the glyphosate, it's more tolerant of the higher rates of glyphosate than the older varieties. So if it's an older variety, not a true flex, then technically you're allowed like up to 6 leaf, which I'm sure we're beyond that, although maybe not on some of the later canola. And then if it's a true flex variety, it's up to the first flowering stage. So the minute you see flowers, you kind of want to shut that off. And then with soybeans as well, it's registered basically from ground crack through flowering. And so once we start to see flowers, we want to shut the glyphosate off. These crops are tolerant to herbicide, they're not immune. And as long as we've given ourselves 10 days in between sprays, if we're doing a second spray or maybe even a third spray on the soybeans, they should be all right. But again, you need to watch the rates and watch that staging. And the problem is once you start spraying flowers, you can start to burn the flowers off, and you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that those flowers end up pollinating and make pods, and that's where the yield is. So.
The only thing I'd like to add to Kim's comment, and just to make it clear to everybody who's listening out there, we're talking straight glyphosate. We're not talking, mixing a little bit of Odyssey in with it to try to get the revenge spraying on the volunteer canola that's coming, or any reflex in it. We don't want to even be going down that road if you're going to go for a late spray close to flowering. So definitely just keep that in mind. Just only glyphosate at that late spraying. So.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Thanks, Dennis. Keeping on the topic of soybeans, John Hurd, this is a question for you regarding, corn as well as soybeans, but starting to see some symptoms of potassium deficiencies on sandy soils. You know, first of all, I guess the question is, what do I look for when I'm trying to diagnose a potassium deficiency, and why is it actually showing up?
Oh, okay, firstly, potassium, it is mobile in the plant. And so that helps us to identify where the problem is. It means it'll move from the lower leaves. The plant will remobilize potassium and try to move it to the new growth. So it actually shows up on the margins of the leaf. So on both soybeans, you'll get yellowing or browning on the margins of the leaflets. At the bottom of the plant, and likewise in corn, it is browning or firing of the outside of the leaves. And it's a survival mechanism by the plant. It uses what the plant's already taken up and moves it to try to sustain new growth. And at this stage, we don't see that there is anything that we do about that other than, like you're talking about, the iron chlorosis. It's a kick in the pants or a reminder. Soil testing, and particularly for corn, we've seen broadcast applications that are rather ineffective. Banding is at least 2 times more effective when you've got potassium deficiency. So that's where we see that going. And the other reminder for corn is that if you're seeing potassium deficiency, the plant's probably going to be deficient later in the season, and that means poor stalk strength and more lodging. So those are fields you don't leave till December to harvest. You harvest them while they're still standing in October. Not surprised on sandy soils. They're inherently low in potassium. And under dry conditions, we don't get as good of uptake of potassium. And it's important to control stomata and regulate water loss. So it may be more common or frequent now that we're into dry periods.
Yeah, and I mean, dry has been a theme this year for a number of different things. Another question came in talking about, I guess, I mean, the dry conditions are causing maybe some of this to show up a little bit more, but it's a question regarding soils that might be deficient in phosphorus, or at least things that are showing up with purple corn. But when the soil testing is done, there's not actually showing a phosphorus deficiency. And in this case, depending on what the history of that field is, especially if we're seeing this around headlands or areas that have had a lot of travel on them, it could actually be compaction issues. So these deficiencies, like say phosphorus, again, one of those nutrients that needs to get into the root of the plant kind of earlier in the season, and root growth is really important for the plant's ability to access things that don't move in the soil, like phosphorus or like potassium. We start seeing some of these things show up. And so it's something to keep in mind that when you're seeing these deficiency symptoms, like say again, that purple corn or phosphorus deficiency, you need to dig around in order to figure out whether or not that's actually, you know, phosphorus showing up because of a lack of phosphorus. You can soil test for that, but it's likely a compaction issue. So going around and actually looking at the roots, looking to see if the roots are actually exploring the soil. And quite often, if you're dealing with compaction issues, the roots are going to tell you pretty quickly if you have something going up in your soil. So sometimes these nutrient deficiencies aren't necessarily a nutrient deficiency. They're actually an inability of the plant to grow to find the nutrients, and that can be due to compaction. So I just wanted to add a comment on that. Another question came in around flax. I was wondering if you guys could talk about heat canker in flax. I've seen it quite noticeable in a few fields. What yield loss could it cause?
Hey, Marla, can you hear me all right? Dane here.
We can hear you, Dane. Yep.
Right on. Okay. Yes, flax, as with other oilseeds, was and is susceptible to heat canker, particularly during that June heat wave that we had, that June 2nd and 5th, something like that, causing heat canker symptoms in flax. Similar to how we saw canola a few weeks back, some of the very small, later seeded stuff emerging through loose, dry soils. And when we have those extremely high temperatures like they're having in BC right now, on those loose, dry soils, that warm, hot air moves into that top inch of soil, and then really just cooks the plant at that level. So heat canker in flax, very similar type of symptom. What it does is it gets very hot down at that base soil line level, and that flax stem, being a little bit woodier than canola, is a little bit more tolerant, I suppose, but it still will develop a swollen knuckle, really is what it looks like, at the base of the stem, right at the soil line level. If the heat canker isn't too severe, the plant will likely just thicken up the stem there and continue to grow through it, or it may wilt and start dying off 7 to 15 days later, something like that, depending on what kind of growing conditions you have after that point. So the grower might be looking at a flax field where the flax parts of it are wilting and dying off and looking smaller than the rest of the plant, but that likely shouldn't continue over the rest of the field. If that was a single event, and if the heat has been relatively a little more regulated, we had a little more moisture, then that heat canker should stop reoccurring, and just those plants that were affected will continue to be affected.
Awesome, thank you, Dane.
If the plants are truly crimped off and get to that point where they wilt and die, I'll just point out that flax is a single stem crop and also a poor weed competitor. So wherever plants are lost, it's not just yield loss, you get weed growth and the crop does not fill in there as it would in canola.
That's
right,
also
well, that's exactly right. I would say that's another argument to make for seeding heavy with flax. When you're going to put a crop in like that, just make sure you have enough there to start with.
Yeah, and some of these things are tricky for us to be dealing with after the fact, right? And so sometimes making those good agronomic decisions at the beginning of the growing season is going to help you through some of these issues as we go through the rest of the season. Anne, a question on spring wheat. Spring wheat's in the heading or in the boot stage. How are the hot and dry conditions affecting flowering? And I guess, you know, there could be a number of things that this could then be affecting, whether it's, you know, a timing your fertilization or fungicide if it's necessary, yield potential, that kind of thing. So what's going on right now with hot, dry conditions affecting flowering in spring wheat?
Sure. So the hot, dry conditions are definitely speeding up growth stages for a lot of plants. So same with spring wheat, that you can see a much shorter time from, say, boot to head to flowering. So, you know, usually flowering would start a few days after head emergence, so maybe 3 days, and would last anywhere from 3 to 5 days. But in these really hot conditions, we can see flowering start much sooner after head emergence and be a shorter period of flowering. So that does affect, if people are applying fungicides for FHB, that does affect the window, because the window would definitely be shortened. And then also just affects, you know, the yield potential of your wheat. So wheat is very sensitive to drought stress and anthesis, and for all crops, you want the flowering period to be as long as possible to have, you know, the most pollination as possible and the most potential for seed set. So having a shorter flowering period can negatively affect the yield. And when conditions are really hot at this time, you know, the rate of photosynthesis definitely decreases. So that's why you end up with, you can have some poor seed sets, so, you know, fewer seeds per head, and then also some smaller seeds per head. So if there are people out there that are applying FHB fungicides or thinking about it around now, it can be a little bit tough in a wheat crop. I've seen quite a few really stagey wheat crops. So, you know, some right now are in full head and flower, and then I come across a patch that's still in the boot stage. So can be a bit tricky to stage that. So just you should obviously be trying to hit as many heads as possible and focusing on the main stems instead of tillers. And you can see where the wheat is in terms of flowering, if it's at early or late flower, because of where the flowers appear on the head. So flowering does start from the middle of the head first. So, you know, if you go out in the morning and you see flowers just in the middle of the head, then you're at early flowering. If you see them on both ends, the top and the bottom, then you'd be later on in the flowering stage.
Oh, John, yes, go ahead.
You and I both talked to a farmer yesterday about some of these crops right now, and I just wanted to butt in there and say some of the cereal crops have been looking okay despite the heat and drought to this point. And part of that is because we see what's happening above the ground, but roots grow and extend below the ground till just after anthesis. So for a cereal crop, it's been tapping into what soil reserves there are, but they're probably out there 3 to 4 foot or deeper depth now. And root growth does not continue forever. It generally ends after anthesis stage. So what you've got for stored soil water is what you've got at this point. The plant isn't doing a lot more exploring. And so that's what's really helped sustain the cereal crops to this point is that new growth into the soil volume that's there. So, an aside.
Yeah, and I would add too, following our conversation with this grower yesterday, a reminder too that the roots are exploring a lot generally, unless they can't for whatever reason. The roots are exploring a lot of the soil, and they're going a lot deeper than I think some people are thinking that they do. And so, I mean, roots are getting down easily into that 2, 3, even 4 foot depth on things like wheat and canola. And so they are going to access moisture deeper if they can get to that moisture. They're not going to grow through a bone dry soil to find moisture, but they'll grow through where there is moist soil. And then there's a kind of I guess, a note to that as well, if we can add that when you're making fertilizer recommendations, you use the top 2 feet to make your nitrogen recommendations as opposed to the top 6 inches that we seem to have found one agronomist doing, which was very interesting. So anyway, I want to get back on track with the wheat question around FHB. So David, we've got 2 questions that have come in, both basically on the same line, and it's a question that we've covered before, and we will keep covering until we're well past our fungicide season, because it's still a question that's on everyone's mind. So if I'm dealing with either a low risk, which I mean, right now we're looking at low risks, you know, how do I make the decision on whether or not I'm actually going to spray fungicide for fusarium head blight?
Well, I guess one of the things is how lush of a crop and how dense of a canopy do you have? What's your yield potential? Whether you can spend some more money. The other thing is the fusarium risk is fluctuating constantly. And in the southwest part of the province right now, if you looked at the map, the risk is going up. Soils are very dry, and you need moist soils in order to drive humidity within the crop. So generally, I'd say the risk is low, and I'm mostly talking to growers who are debating whether or not to use a fungicide for this crop. And what Anne had to say about the very compressed flowering period, that also mitigates risk to some extent. Then there's also tillers. I was in some winter wheat crops yesterday, and they're past the risk now, but you can see there's a real range of flowering time with the different tillers. So which are the ones that are going to make up your yield? That's also a consideration. And spring wheat crops up in the Interlake seem to be catching up to the winter wheat too. A lot of them are in full head, flowering, on the verge of flowering.
Next question on our list here is for John Gablowski. Why am I seeing so many blister beetles this year, and are they a threat to my field crops?
The first part to that question, why so many? There's actually 3 species we're seeing a lot of this year. One is a fairly large black blister beetle. The other one's a gray color, and the other one is a metallic green and purple one called Nuttall's blister beetle. Now the black and the gray one, the larvae of those species are grasshopper egg specialists when they're young. So their larvae start out as very mobile larvae that can easily seek out grasshopper eggs. They find the eggs, and then they change into what I call a couch potato. They're no longer a quick, sleek larva. They lose their mobility, and they just feast on grasshopper eggs the rest of their larval life. And when grasshopper levels go up, as they've been doing for the past few years, you see more of those black and gray blister beetles, just because there's lots of food for them. Now the metallic one, that's Nuttall's blister beetle, they feed on things in the ground as well. They're probably not so specialized on grasshopper eggs, but we're certainly seeing a lot of those around as well. Now, what they can do to your crop, they are defoliators as adults. They feed on lots of different things, and you would use defoliation thresholds, but I almost have to throw in a caution there. All three species are highly gregarious, so you will usually see much more along a field edge, and you usually see them in patches. And if you stumble into a patch where there's lots of them, sometimes it looks bad, and it gets people alarmed. So my caution is walk a little ways, see if that density of beetles and the defoliation is consistent. Usually it's very patchy. So usually there's no need to spray a whole field. And in fact, it's very rare for anybody to spray a field for blister beetles. In a crop like soybeans, the vegetative stages, soybeans can take 30–35% defoliation. You would need a lot for it to be economical. Potatoes is another one, vegetative stages, about 30% defoliation. It reduces once you get into flowering, same as in soybeans. So where we do have defoliation thresholds, that's what you would use, but don't just do your assessment in that patch where there's lots of them. That is on average across the field for those defoliation thresholds to be applicable.
Another insect question for you, John. What is the rusty reddish colored grasshopper called that's currently feeding on my cereal crops?
The rusty reddish color.
Yeah, we're seeing one that's apparently kind of a rusty red color. It's difficult to, this is putting your diagnostic skills to the test.
It's ready for Canada Day if it's red.
Yeah, you know, I'll be guessing because the ones that we normally get most of are the two-striped and the clear wing. Neither is rusty red. Two-striped is either brown or green with some black lines going down the back when they're juveniles. Clear wing is very dark brown to start, and then it lightens a bit as it goes through its stages. So yeah, you know, I would need to see a photo and see the color that they're seeing. It doesn't match up with any of our pest species, rusty red as juveniles.
I would say that if we're putting you to the test on trying to identify grasshoppers through description like this, then we're going to put our poster to the test to see what their photography skills look like. And then they just posted, sounds good, I will send you a picture. So you can watch for that coming in your email, John.
Okay.
And we'll see whether or not there's something kind of interesting showing up we can talk about next week. And speaking of next week, we've hit the end of our half-hour session. So we are going to wrap things up for today. Thank you to, again, all of our panelists. Thank you to all of our participants posting questions for us. This has been a lot of fun for us to be running these diagnostic question and answer sessions for you. And so we're really appreciating all of the time and effort that everybody else is putting into watching these and posting questions for us, which is fantastic. So again, thank you, everybody. Have a great week, and we will see you next week.
Bye.